The Chernobyl disaster of April 26, 1986, has had a lasting impact on the world, not least of all in how we think of nuclear power. Despite being the most famous nuclear disaster in history, there are still many secrets and elements of the event that remain unknown to most people today. Number 10. When we think of contamination spreading from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, most think of contaminants getting into the air and being blown across Europe in clouds. But there's another almost invisible way contamination can spread. In the months after the disaster, engineers found themselves in a race against time to protect the important water sources near Chernobyl from groundwater contamination. Chernobyl sits close to the Pripyat River. This was an important decision by the initial designers, as water was needed for the everyday running of the plant. But the Pripyat wasn't just any river. It was a tributary, an incredibly important river in Ukraine and Belarus. Not only is it important for navigation, but it's also a key source of water for drinking and irrigation. Like most rivers, the Pripyat isn't only fed by surface water. Groundwater deep beneath the surface slowly flows into the river through streams invisible to most. This water takes with it nutrients that have seeped through the soil and any chemicals that may have been sprayed on the surface. A major worry after Chernobyl was that it would also take radioactive material. If the Pripyat River were significantly contaminated, it could mean even more devastation across an even larger area. To try to stop this from happening, engineers were brought in to construct an enormous wall around the nuclear power plant. This wall was nearly 2 miles long and stood almost 100 meters tall from its base. It was entirely underground and cannot be seen at the surface today. The underground slurry wall was an enormous engineering feat. Even in normal circumstances, like the building of walls for subway systems, building something like this would be difficult, but the pressure and danger that workers were under in 1986 made things even more challenging. Even planning the construction was difficult. Many of the diagrams that would show pipes and underground electrical wires in the area had been destroyed. Engineers would have to plan around known obstacles and hope that nothing else was hiding in the designated area. Physical work began with digging through multiple layers of soil, sand, and groundwater before reaching a layer of clay, which doesn't allow water to pass through as easily as sandy soils. This narrow channel was then filled with a compressed mixture of bentonite, clay, and cement, which would create a barrier that water could not travel through. This needed specialist equipment. The hole was to be completely vertical, and the bentonite mixture had to be immediately pumped into an exposed layer to stop it from collapsing. The equipment needed couldn't be found within the Soviet Union and had to be purchased from a company in Italy. Engineers were sent to Italy to learn how to use the machines, and employees were not allowed to travel to Chernobyl. After months of work, the effort paid off. The 2-mile-long wall was constructed, along with wells that would ensure the project would withstand the test of time. The wall withstood its first test when heavy snow that winter put pressure on all the water protection systems around Chernobyl. Scientists studying the Pripyat River and water around Chernobyl have found the entire project may not have even been necessary. The river has been polluted by contaminants, but not to a level that makes the downstream water particularly dangerous. On top of this, groundwater contamination doesn't appear to be a major issue. Despite this, most agreed that constructing the underground wall was probably the right decision. At a time when nobody could have known just what the most significant risks were, it was better to be safe than sorry. Number 9. For the past 40 years, the area around the abandoned Chernobyl nuclear power plant has become something like a large, unintended nature reserve. With human activity at a minimum, plants and animals have taken over the exclusion zones. Species that were once considered endangered have begun to thrive in the area, and every development of life found near Chernobyl is met with fascination by the outside world. Many animals that have made their home here have adapted to their new environment in one way or another. That could involve changes to their physical appearance, such as frogs with much darker skin colors or something more invisible. There's one species that's captured the public's attention more than any other, and an apparent visible change that appeared in October 2025 made headlines around the world. Chernobyl's dogs are popular among tourists and scientists alike. When cities like Pripyat were evacuated, most residents believed they would only be away for a few days, and pets, including dogs, were left behind. It was believed they wouldn't live long in the radioactive zone, but the dogs survived. Today, there are some 700 dogs within the exclusion zone. Many are friendly, having learned to expect food from tourists, but others are more wary of human interactions. Organizations like the Dogs of Chernobyl group have been caring for the canines. This primarily involves catching the dogs for vaccination, providing health care, and making sure they can't reproduce. Scientists also work with the organizations to study the health impact the environment is having on these animals, and any genetic changes that have occurred over the generations. Scientists have noted that there are now distinct genetic markers that distinguish Chernobyl dogs from those living outside the exclusion zone. Whether this is down to the proximity of radioactivity or simply due to their isolation is still unknown. In October of 2025, Dogs of Chernobyl posted a photo on social media that seemed to show a more obvious change. The photo was of a dog with bright blue fur. Some questioned whether the image was edited, but the organization insisted it was real. But it was unlikely the strange fur color had anything to do with radioactivity. They noted that people who'd seen the dogs just a few days earlier hadn't noticed anything strange about their fur. By analyzing where the photos were taken, the organization believed they'd figured out the cause of the strange fur. Nearby, an old portable toilet could be found. While nobody had seen it themselves, it seemed most likely that the explanation was something far more mundane than it first seemed. The chemical system within the toilet had been leaking a blue fluid used to treat sewage. The dog had simply been rolling around in the chemical, which had dyed their fur to the strange color. The organization noted that they did not believe it would cause any significant harm to the animals, unless they licked their fur entirely clean. Within a few days, the blue fur had begun to fade, and it seemed like the problem had resolved itself. Number 8. The AZ-5 button, the most infamous piece of equipment at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, triggered the disaster on April 26, 1986. Its function was to drop control rods into Reactor 4 to halt the reaction. Normally automatic, the AZ-5 was manually engaged during a power outage test when safety measures were disabled. At 1:23 a.m., the button was pressed. The control rods descended about a third of the way. A design flaw meant the control rod's graphite tips reached the core first, displacing water and increasing the reaction before the neutron-absorbing boron could fully enter. The resulting heat damaged the channels, stopping the rod's descent and leading to the meltdown. A theory suggests the button was pressed twice. The teletype recorded Emergency Protection 5 at 1:23 a.m., followed 2 seconds later by a second incomplete emergency protection signal. While others suggested it could have been the AZ-1 or the water pump disconnect or a glitch, some experts believe it was a second AZ-5 signal. The theory posits the operator released the button momentarily, either accidentally or intending only to limit the reaction, before pressing it again. Releasing the button would have stopped the rods from fully lowering, thereby contributing to the disaster, and potentially explaining a witness report of a blast before the official press time. The theory shifts blame from the reactor's design flaw to human error, but the official report states the rods moved for 8 seconds, lowering a third of the way. If the button was released for 2 seconds, the rods would have only moved for 6 seconds and lowered just a quarter of the way, suggesting no pause. The ambiguity of that second signal, the glitch or water pump disconnect, means the truth is likely unknown. Number 7. When thinking of the liquidators who risked their lives to clean up after the disaster, most people think of the firefighters who were sent onto the roof of the destroyed reactor. But other liquidators were sent to an opposite part of the site, preventing what they believed would be an even bigger catastrophe than the initial disaster. Tons of material were dropped onto the nuclear reactor from above in an attempt to smother graphite fires. The material did its job, although most actually missed the target entirely. Unfortunately, it also created a shell around the spent fuel once hardened, which seemed to be heating the radioactive material inside. It was almost impossible to tell what was actually going on within that shell, and scientists monitoring the site feared the worst. If it became too hot, it could potentially melt through the base of the building. Depending on how far it went, the material could potentially hit the groundwater level beneath the reactor, contaminating the water and creating a steam eruption that would cause even more damage. There was little that could be done to change the situation from above. That would require breaking through the shell, which would be extremely hazardous to the workers' health and might do more harm than good. The decision was made to try to cool the core from below. Experts were brought in from Kiev Metrobud, the company responsible for building the Kiev metro system. The metro was at the time the deepest in the world, and still one of the deepest today. The engineers were the most capable available, but even they would be facing difficult challenges to make the plan work. The initial plan was to create a horizontal tunnel between the foundation of the reactor building and the water table. This would be very narrow, thick enough only for drills that would be digging it out. Liquid nitrogen would then be pumped into the space beneath Reactor 4, cooling the core from below. Engineers from the company worked on this plan until May 16th, but then the plans changed. Scientists had changed their estimates, and now a new cooling system would be required. This required a wider tunnel to be built to accommodate people, and a chamber to be excavated beneath Unit 4. In this chamber, heat exchangers would be set up, which would more efficiently cool the reactor. Miners switched places with engineers from the metro company. These miners worked in sweltering conditions, often too hot to even wear respirators. The tunnel was narrow, made even smaller by the equipment needed to remove the soil, and men were at a constant risk due to the radiation exposure. At one point, there was a sound of a crack overheard, and it seemed as if the tunnel ceiling might give way. Thankfully, that didn't happen, and the tunneling continued. Less than a month after the disaster, the tunnel was complete, and the cooling system was installed. Dozens of men had risked their lives to prevent a catastrophe, and many were left with debilitating health conditions for the rest of their lives. But it would later emerge that the heroic effort may not have been needed after all. The core had cooled, and there was actually no risk of it melting through the reactor floor. Number 6. According to the official version of events, the Chernobyl disaster began with 2 blasts in quick succession, taking place at around 1:24 a.m. The precise cause of these blasts is still debated, but the most common explanation is that they were caused by a steam eruption, and possibly a pressurized hydrogen. But according to some data, there was a 3rd blast, several minutes after the first 2, which remains unexplained to this day. A largely debunked theory suggests that an earthquake was to blame for the Chernobyl disaster. A seismic station not far from the power plant recorded 2 distinctive seismic events. The theory suggests that the first is an earthquake, which triggered the meltdown, which caused the second event. While this analysis is believed by most scientists to be untrue, the fact that there were 2 seismic events is undisputed. The first lines up with the traditional 1:24 a.m. blast that everyone knows about. The second, though, is much more mysterious. The seismic station isn't the only place that's recorded, though. The operators within the nuclear plant themselves made note of it. At 1:39 a.m., operators noted the phrase reactor explosion. This was over 15 minutes after the initial blast. It might be easy to believe they were simply delayed in making their notes or got the timing wrong, but this isn't the case. The earlier event had already been described. The second blast was definitely distinct from the first. Not much information about this blast, other than the timing, was recorded. By this point, much of the equipment that would have made automatic recordings of these events had been destroyed, and most focus was on the destroyed reactor. The second blast was much weaker than the first, and figuring out the cause wasn't a priority at the time. Unfortunately, this does mean that the valuable evidence that could have helped to solve the mystery has been lost. There is some evidence that could provide an answer, though. Readings from other parts of the unit recorded an increase and then a sudden drop in pressure in airtight compartments and the steam separator areas. That pressure drop could have been caused by the blast itself. If the blast damaged the airtight containers, the gas that had been building within them would suddenly be released. but it's also possible that the increase in pressure was the direct cause of the blast. The initial disaster is believed to have caused an increase in the amount of hydrogen, which would have been sent to these airtight containers. Normally, this would have been pumped back out, but those pumps were not working at the time of the disaster. If the buildup of this hydrogen had nowhere to go, the only option for release would be to rupture the container, potentially causing the blast. But this is just a theory. Some believe a hydrogen blast was actually responsible for the second event that happened that night, making it less likely this was also the cause of the third. Explorers who have ventured into Unit 4 have reported damage to the areas in question, but it's impossible to say for certain that this wasn't caused by the initial blast or as a consequence of cleanup efforts. Number 5. Dotted around the exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl are some of the creepiest and most disturbing abandoned locations found anywhere on Earth. This is a place where humans have disappeared, leaving behind remnants of lives that were changed forever. Up until 2020, one of the creepiest of these locations was the Emerald Summer Camp. The Emerald Summer Camp was once one of the first stops on many tours into the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Unlike many popular sites, it remained relatively unknown to most people, making it even creepier than places like the abandoned city of Ukraine. It was located not far from the village of Lelev, at the end of the path that goes into the forest. First built in 1970, by 1986 it was made up of around 100 cabins. They sat near the river and the cooling pond, which seemed more like a normal lake to children who visited the camp. Despite the nearby nuclear power plant, it was as close to the wilderness as many children would experience. For over a decade, it served as a summer camp for children living in Chernobyl 2, a closed city that housed workers at the military installations. This was a place where children could come and have fun, relax, and get fresh air. The cabins were painted with cheerful children's cartoon characters, including Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Illustrations of cheerful children and animals could also be found. As well as the cabins, the campsite also included a library, ballroom, boat station, cinema, and shop. Outside, there was a playground area and a large water tower. Like most parts of the exclusion zone, the Emerald Summer Camp was abandoned after the disaster, but it took on a disturbing new life. The cabins that had once housed excited children were now used by liquidators. The men and women who risked their lives to contain the disaster would stay in the cabins on their downtime, and eventually they would also leave the camp, and it was completely abandoned. For many years, visitors would come to the summer camp to take photos of the eerie paintings and abandoned playground equipment. Equipment left by the liquidators could also be found inside the cabins, giving a strange juxtaposition of before and after the disaster. The camp became popular with photographers who wanted to capture images of what the world might look like if humans suddenly disappeared. Unfortunately, that came to an end in 2020. Wildfires in the exclusion zone were nothing new. There's minimal maintenance from humans within the zone, and dry leaves and grass collect and can easily catch fire. In 2020, wildfires were particularly devastating, coming close to the power plant itself. While it didn't significantly increase the risk of exposure to radioactive materials, it did do significant damage to many of the most popular locations for tourists to visit, including the Emerald Summer Camp. Today, little of the camp remains, but it's been preserved digitally through countless photos, videos, and even 3D models. Number 4. In early 2022, Chernobyl was captured by Russian forces during the invasion of Ukraine. For over a month, the invading troops held the non-working power plant, sparking fears of a new nuclear disaster. Plant workers, who maintained the facility's stability, continued to work under duress. Meanwhile, soldiers dug trenches in contaminated soil, drove through the red forest, and lit campfires without protective gear, allegedly sickening many from radiation exposure. Though fighting did not occur within the exclusion zone, Russian soldiers left, taking nearly 200 captured Ukrainian soldiers. Returning scientists discovered that over 100 sources of ionizing radiation used for testing and calibration were damaged or stolen, along with contaminated soil, computers, and vehicles. Looting was extensive, with spare wheels allegedly removed from armored carriers to fit more stolen goods. This discovery raised concerns about the material being used in a dirty weapon, but scientists considered this unlikely, as the material was common and not suitable for traditional nuclear weapons. It was deemed more probable that soldiers stole the items as souvenirs or for resale. Accidental contamination remains a significant concern, and the long-term impact of the invasion on Chernobyl is still being studied. Number 3. Despite the Chernobyl disaster, life initially went on, including a May 1st parade and the planned International Peace Race cycling event, set to start on May 9th. This race, known as the Tour de France of the East, and a major propaganda tool during the Cold War, was supposed to start in Kiev, following its inclusion as a host city in 1986. Although news of the meltdown had reached Western Europe and some of Eastern Bloc countries, its severity was often downplayed. Canceling the Kiev stages was seen as politically impossible, as it would admit that the disaster was serious. Consequently, while many Western European competitors withdrew, a decision often framed politically as Western exaggeration, cyclists from communist countries were pressured to compete to boost their careers and avoid political repercussions. One Czechoslovakian racer, Vladimir Kozarek, who fell ill, faced rigorous testing to prove he wasn't faking it and was later shunned, missing out on major events. Ultimately, 64 riders competed in the 1986 peace race, won by Josef Rejek, who later fell ill, with doctors unable to rule out a link to Chernobyl. But radiation testing during the event suggested Kiev's radiation levels were no higher than Poland's, indicating the race may have been less dangerous than feared. Number 2. The impact of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster reached far beyond Ukraine and Belarus. It was in Sweden where the outside world first learned that the accident had occurred, and it's here that some of the people most affected by the disaster outside of the Soviet Union are located. The disaster spread radioactive material across much of Europe. As far away as the United Kingdom, sheep had to be monitored for decades after the disaster. But to the north, in Scandinavia, things were even more troubling. Rain falling in southern Sweden and Norway brought with it radioactive caesium, a material that has a half-life of 30 years. The government put heavy restrictions on any food that might have been contaminated by nuclear material. The level of radiation that food was allowed to emit was so low that a huge amount of produce had to be thrown away. This was even though food which was more radioactive had been sold in the past, that contamination coming from Soviet weapon tests from years earlier. The restrictions didn't impact everyone equally. Those most affected were the southern Sami people. The Sami people were an indigenous group who lived in Scandinavia and Finland. They have their own unique culture, one in which reindeer farming is incredibly important. In Sweden, for example, reindeer herding is a defining part of what makes someone Sami. So being unable to herd this animal wasn't just an economic problem, but a cultural one. Unfortunately, the reindeer is an animal more impacted than most by the nuclear fallout. A key food source for the animal is lichen, a strange type of organism that exists as a colony of algae or cyanobacteria and fungi. It typically grows on trees, but it isn't a plant. It doesn't have roots in a traditional sense. It consumes nutrients from the air. It also absorbed the radioactive caesium. Lichen also takes decades to grow. Theoretically, grass contaminated with caesium could be removed, and if uncontaminated soil was laid down, it would only take a short amount of time before uncontaminated grass was growing. The same could not be done for lichen. Considering how important the reindeer is to the Sami people, central governments in Sweden and Norway offered compensation for reindeer meat that could not be consumed. People were encouraged to continue herding the animals, even though it would be impossible to consume their meat. Instead, the meat was simply buried or fed to foxes and mink at fur farms. Some tried to adapt their farming techniques. Feed was brought in from other areas to try to limit how lichen was consumed. Culling took place at different times of the year when radioactivity was at a minimum, but this often meant there wasn't as much meat. Even with these methods, there was still a huge impact on the lives of the southern Sami. parents would normally send meat to children who were away at school as a way to keep their ties to their homes. Those bonds weren't considered the same if the meat wasn't from their family's herds. There was also the fact that the reindeer wasn't only used for meat. Everything from the antlers to the hooves was used for something, be it stock for stews or thread for clothes. Not only could parents not teach their children the traditional practices, but it also meant relying on outside sources for things that would normally come from the reindeer. The southern Sami people have largely adapted to the impact of the Chernobyl disaster. Reindeer are still herded, and in many places the meat is now able to be consumed, but the impact of the disaster is likely to be felt for many generations. Number 1. Although the initial Chernobyl fires were out by early May of 1986, a second fire erupted inside Unit 4 on May 23rd, almost a month after the disaster began. The second fire was kept secret by the Soviet Union for over a decade. Shortly before 2 a.m., staff surveying damage at the South Pump Hall discovered a fire, likely caused by electrical cables after power had been restored to Unit 4. 9 fire departments and 138 firefighters, led by Vladimir Maximchuk, responded. Aware of the radiation danger, Maximchuk implemented a system where 5-man teams worked for only 10 minutes at a time to minimize exposure. It took it half an hour to find the source: glowing wires that had ignited flammable material. Due to access issues, foam was used to smother the blaze. The fire was put out with minimal human injury, though 1 man broke his leg. Maximchuk was initially criticized for his unconventional tactics, which later influenced future firefighting procedures in hazardous environments. Despite minimizing his men's exposure, Maximchuk stayed on site the entire time, receiving a much higher dose. He reportedly stayed until he passed out and was hospitalized. The Soviet authorities covered up the fire and Maximchuk's radiation-related illness, wanting to hide a second incident so soon after the first. Maximchuk continued his career, but passed away on May 22, 1994, from complications believed to be a result of his exposure. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.